Our family dinners were always loud. Not the angry kind of loud, but the happy kind, where everyone talks over everyone else, and the sound of laughter is like another guest at the table. Dad would be telling one of his jokes that only he found funny. Mom would be trying to get everyone to eat more vegetables, and Grandma would be humming little tunes from her chair in the corner, tapping her foot. I loved the noise. It felt like a warm blanket. That Sunday was no different. The smell of roasted chicken and potatoes filled our small house, and the windows were foggy from the heat of the oven and all the people crammed inside. I was sitting between Mom and my Uncle Ben, who kept sneaking me pieces of bread when he thought Mom wasn't looking. I'd finished my plate, drawing circles in the leftover gravy, when the grown-up talk started to get boring. It was all about things like mortgages and something called a recession, which sounded like a sad, gray cloud. I wriggled off my chair. "I'm going to play," I announced to no one in particular. Mom just nodded, already deep in conversation with Aunt Carol. I wandered out of the dining room, my socks sliding on the wooden floor. I passed my bedroom with all its familiar toys, but I wasn't in the mood for them. Instead, I found myself standing in front of the door to my dad's study. We weren't really supposed to go in there. It was his quiet place, filled with big, serious books that had no pictures. But the door was slightly open, a little slice of darkness that promised something different. I pushed it gently. The room smelled like old paper and leather. A big desk sat in the middle, and moonlight from the window made a silver square on the floor. It was so quiet in there. The happy noise from the dinner seemed a million miles away. On a shelf tucked behind a row of books was a small wooden box. It wasn't dusty like some of the other things. It looked like someone opened it sometimes. My fingers found the little latch. Inside there wasn't much. Some old medals that weren't shiny anymore, a dried flower, and a photograph. It was a picture of a woman I had never seen before. She had hair the color of honey, and she was smiling, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her eyes looked a little bit like my dad's. She was beautiful, and she was holding a small baby wrapped in a blue blanket. It wasn't me. I knew all my baby pictures. I didn't think anything of it. It was just a picture. So I took it from the box, carefully closing the lid, and slid back out of the study. I walked back into the bright, loud dining room, holding the photo in my hand. Everyone was laughing at something Uncle Ben had said. I held it up. "Dad?" I asked, my voice cutting through the noise. The laughter stopped. Not slowly, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. I held the photo higher so he could see. "At the family dinner," I said, repeating the game show host I'd heard on TV, my voice full of playground importance. Everyone went quiet when I asked who the woman in the photo was. And they did. Every single person at that table, Mom, Dad, Grandma, Uncle Ben, Aunt Carol, just stared. First at the photo, then at me. The happy noise was gone, and the silence that replaced it was heavy and cold. It wasn't like the quiet in the study. This was a scary quiet. Dad's face went pale, and Mom reached for his hand under the table. Grandma stopped humming. It was the first time I realized that some questions were bigger than they seemed. My arm, still holding the photograph, started to feel heavy. No one moved. It felt like one of those games we played, statues, where you had to freeze in funny positions. But no one was smiling. Dad's eyes were locked on the picture. He didn't look angry, just empty, like when you drink all your juice and there's nothing left in the cup. He finally blinked and slowly reached across the table, his hand trembling just a little. "Where did you get this, Clara?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than his study. It was sharp, like a piece of broken glass. "In your office," I said, my own voice now a whisper, "in the little wooden box." He took the photograph from my fingers. His thumb brushed over the woman's smiling face. For a second, I thought he was going to cry. Mom put her arm around my shoulders and squeezed gently. It was the kind of squeeze that meant, "Be quiet now." "It's nothing, sweetie," Mom said, her voice trying to sound cheerful, but it was wobbly, like a tricycle on a bumpy road. "It's just an old picture. Why don't you go and see if Grandma wants help with the dishes?" But Grandma was still frozen, her hands clasped in her lap, staring at Dad. Even Uncle Ben, who always had a joke, was just looking down at his plate as if it was the most interesting thing in the world. Dad carefully slid the photo into his shirt pocket, the one right over his heart. "It's all right, Helen," he said to my mom, but his eyes were still far away. He cleared his throat and looked around the table at all the faces watching him. "The chicken was lovely," he said, but it sounded strange, like he was reading words from a book he didn't understand. The party was over. Not officially, no one said goodbye, but the warmth had left the room. Aunt Carol and Uncle Ben started clearing their plates in a hurry, their movements stiff and awkward. They didn't look at me. It felt like I was invisible, but not in a fun, superpower kind of way. It felt like I was a ghost. They mumbled their goodbyes at the door, giving Mom quick, tight hugs and patting Dad on the shoulder. I stood by the doorway to the kitchen, watching. I felt a knot in my stomach. I knew I had done something wrong, but I didn't know what it was. It was like breaking a rule I never knew existed. After the front door clicked shut, Mom sighed. It was a long, tired sound. She turned to me, her face soft but serious. "Clara, you know you're not supposed to go into Daddy's study without asking." "The door was open," I said, my lower lip starting to tremble. "I know, but some things are private. You have to respect that," she said. She knelt down so her eyes were level with mine. "It's okay. You didn't know. But we don't talk about that picture, all right? It makes Daddy sad." "Who is she?" I asked, the question popping out before I could stop it. Dad had walked over to the window and was staring out into the dark garden. He answered without turning around. His voice was flat. "Her name was Sarah. She was my first wife." Then he turned, and for the first time, he looked directly at me. But it was a strange look. It was like he was looking right through me at something far behind me. "And that baby," he added, his voice cracking just a tiny bit. "That was your brother." The word hung in the air. Brother. I didn't have a brother. I had a bedroom with one bed. I had parents who called me their one and only. The knot in my stomach twisted tighter. The happy, loud house I knew was gone, and in its place was this silent, confusing one. And I had a feeling it was all my fault. A word is a small thing. You can say it or write it. It's just a sound or a few letters on a page. But the word brother wasn't small. The moment my dad said it, it grew. It filled the whole room, pushing all the air out. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I had always wanted a brother. I'd asked for one for Christmas, for my birthday. I'd promised to share all my toys and even let him have the remote control sometimes. Mom and Dad would just smile and share a look I didn't understand. "You're our special girl," they'd say. "Our one and only." But that wasn't true. Mom took a step towards Dad. "Tom," she said, her voice soft but strained. "Not now." My dad, Tom. It was strange hearing her use his name. She was always Mom, and he was always Dad. Hearing his real name made him seem like a stranger. He didn't seem to hear her. He was just looking at me, with those empty, hollow eyes. "Clara," he said, and his voice was rough, like sandpaper. "Go to your room." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. I turned without another word, my feet feeling like heavy blocks of wood. I walked down the hall, and the silence followed me. I could feel their eyes on my back. I closed my bedroom door, and the click of the latch sounded as loud as a gunshot in the quiet house. I sat on the edge of my bed. My dolls were lined up on my pillow, their plastic smiles seeming to mock me. My storybooks were neatly stacked on my nightstand. Everything in my room was just for me, for the one and only. I felt a hot, prickly feeling behind my eyes. I had a brother, or I had one once. Where was he? Was he with the lady in the picture? Sarah. The quiet from the living room was worse than the shouting would have been. I could almost hear the silence. It was made up of all the things they weren't saying. I crept to my door and pressed my ear against the cool wood. I could hear whispers. Mom's voice, hurried and pleading. Dad's voice, low and broken. I couldn't make out the words, just sounds. They were like the sounds of animals in pain. I went back to my bed and crawled under the covers, pulling them all the way over my head. It was dark and warm, but it didn't feel safe anymore. The warm blanket of my family's noise had been ripped away, and now I was cold. I had broken something. I had found a secret that was meant to stay hidden in its little wooden box, and by bringing it into the light, I had broken my family. It felt like hours later when my door opened. A sliver of hallway light cut through the darkness. It was Mom. She came and sat on the bed, her weight making the mattress dip. "You awake, sweetie?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I pretended to be asleep, breathing slow and steady. She stroked my hair, her hand gentle. "It's complicated, Clara," she sighed. "Things that happened a long, long time ago. Before you." She paused. "We love you so much. You know that, right? You are our whole world." But I wasn't. There was a whole other world before me. A world with a different wife and a different child. A brother. Mom leaned down and kissed my forehead. Her lips were cold. "Good night, my love." She walked out, closing the door softly behind her. The house went completely silent after that. I lay there in the dark, my eyes wide open. The question I'd asked at dinner echoed in my head. Who is the woman in the photo? It was a simple question. But now I knew that simple questions could have answers so big they could change everything. And I had a feeling there were still more answers hiding in the shadows of our quiet house. The next morning, the sun came up just like it always did, but our house didn't wake up with it. Usually, weekend mornings were filled with the smell of pancakes and the sound of cartoons on the TV. Dad would make the pancakes into funny shapes, and I would drench them in so much syrup that Mom would shake her head, pretending to be annoyed. But this morning, there was only silence. I walked into the kitchen, and Dad was already at the table, dressed in his work clothes even though it was a Monday. He was just staring into a black cup of coffee. He didn't look up when I came in. "Good morning," I said, my voice sounding small in the big room. He flinched, like my voice had poked him. "Morning, Clara," he mumbled, but his eyes didn't leave the cup. Mom was at the stove, but she wasn't cooking. She was just standing there, her back to us. She turned around and gave me a smile, but it was a tired, brittle thing. "I poured you some cereal, sweetie," she said, pointing to a bowl on the counter. The box of Cheerios sat next to it. No funny-shaped pancakes today. Breakfast was a quiet, lonely affair. The only sounds were the scrape of my spoon against the ceramic bowl and the loud ticking of the clock on the wall. I kept looking from Mom to Dad. Mom was trying. She kept asking me questions about school, about my friends, but her voice was too bright, too forced. Dad didn't say a word. He just drank his coffee, then stood up, rinsed his cup in the sink, and walked to the door. "Have a good day at work," Mom called after him. "You too," he said, and then he was gone. He didn't even kiss her goodbye. He always kissed her goodbye. The silence he left behind was even heavier. Mom's fake smile finally crumbled. She sank into a chair and put her head in her hands. I walked over and touched her arm. "Is Dad mad at me?" I asked. She looked up, and her eyes were shiny with tears. She was trying not to cry. "Oh no, honey. No, not at you. He's just sad. It's an old sadness, and you just accidentally opened the door to it." I spent the rest of the day feeling like a ghost in my own home. I played in my room, but the toys felt like strangers' things. The whole house felt like it belonged to another family. The laughter that used to live in the walls was gone. That afternoon, while Mom was taking a nap, something she never did, I decided I couldn't stand the not knowing anymore. I went to the phone in the kitchen. My fingers were shaking as I dialed Grandma's number. I knew it by heart. She answered on the second ring. "Hello, my little songbird," she said, her voice warm and familiar. It was the first normal thing I had heard all day. "Grandma?" I whispered. Her tone changed immediately. "Clara? What's wrong, darling? Is everything all right? Will you tell me?" I asked, the words tumbling out. "About the lady, Sarah, and the baby." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing. "Oh, Clara," she said, and her voice was full of sorrow. "That's a story for your father to tell." "He won't," I said, a tear rolling down my cheek. "He won't even look at me. And Mom just looks sad. The house is so quiet, Grandma. I hate the quiet." She sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I know, child. I know." She was quiet for another moment. "Sarah was a lovely girl, full of life. She and your father were very happy." Another pause. "She got very sick, Clara, after the baby was born. A sickness in her mind that the doctors couldn't fix. A sickness in her mind." I tried to picture it. It was a scary thought. "And the baby?" I asked, my heart thumping. "My brother? His name was Daniel," she said softly. "He was a beautiful baby." She stopped, and I knew she wasn't going to say more. "You must be patient with your father, Clara. He buried that part of his life a long, long time ago. Seeing that picture, it was like digging it all up again. He just needs time." When I hung up the phone, I had more pieces, but the puzzle was even messier. A sick mother, a brother named Daniel, and a father who was so sad he couldn't even look at me. I walked past the study. The door was closed tight, but I knew that the secrets were still in there, waiting. Weeks went by, and the silence in our house became a solid thing. It was like a new piece of furniture that no one wanted, but everyone had to walk around. The happy noise of our family dinners felt like a distant dream, something I might have seen in a movie. Dad started working late most nights. When he was home, he'd sit in his armchair, the TV on, but the volume low, his eyes not really seeing it. Mom and I would eat dinner together at the kitchen table, the two of us making small talk that felt like trying to fill a giant, empty swimming pool with a teaspoon. I stopped asking questions. I learned that the word Sarah and the name Daniel were like invisible walls. If I even got close to them, my parents would retreat further into their own quiet worlds. So, I talked about school, my spelling tests, and the silly things my friend Lucy did. Mom would smile and nod, her mind clearly somewhere else. The worst part was bedtime. Dad used to be the one who tucked me in. He'd read me a story, his voice making silly characters and dramatic booms. He would always end by calling me his one and only star and kissing my forehead. Now he just poked his head in the door. "Night, Clara," he'd say, his voice tired, and then he'd be gone before I could even say it back. The stories stopped. I was no longer his star. I felt like a little, forgotten moon. One evening, I couldn't sleep. The house was finally dark and quiet, the way it was supposed to be. I tiptoed out of my room and saw a light on downstairs. It was coming from the study. The door was closed, but I could see the yellow line of light underneath it. I crept down the stairs, my heart doing a little nervous dance in my chest. I stood by the door, listening. I heard a sound, a soft, choked noise. It took me a moment to realize what it was. My dad was crying. It wasn't loud, just a quiet, hopeless sound that made my own throat feel tight. I knew I shouldn't be there. Mom had told me to respect his privacy, but I couldn't make my feet move away. He was my dad. The dad who taught me how to ride my bike, who made pancake monsters, who always knew how to make me laugh. And he was hurting. I thought about the photograph, the woman with the sad smile and the baby in the blue blanket. I thought about the names Grandma had given me, Sarah and Daniel, my father's secret family, his secret sadness. I had been so focused on how the secret had made me feel, confused and left out, that I hadn't really thought about how it made him feel. He hadn't just lost a wife, he had lost a son, my brother. Standing there in the dark hallway, a new feeling washed over me, pushing aside the confusion and the fear. It was a fierce, protective love for my dad. He wasn't mad at me. He was trapped in a sad story that had happened a long time ago, and I had been the one to remind him of it. Maybe I could be the one to help him. I didn't knock. I didn't say a word. I just slowly, quietly turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. He was sitting at his desk, but he wasn't working. The wooden box was open in front of him, and he was holding the photograph. His shoulders were shaking. He didn't hear me come in. I walked over to him, my socked feet silent on the rug. I reached out my small hand and placed it on his arm. He jumped, startled, and quickly tried to hide the picture. His face streaked with tears. "Clara, you should be in bed." "I know," I said softly. My voice wasn't wobbly. It was calm. "I heard you." He just stared at me, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't know what to say. The dad who always had an answer was lost for words. "It's okay to be sad, Daddy," I whispered. And with those words, the dam inside him broke. My father crumpled. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, weary surrender. His shoulders, which had always seemed so strong and broad, hunched forward, and he buried his face in his hands. The quiet sobs that had shaken him before now gave way to deep, aching grief, the kind that had been locked away for a far too long. I didn't move. I just kept my small hand on his arm, a tiny anchor in his storm of sadness. He cried for a long time, and I just waited. The ticking clock in the hall seemed to be holding its breath with me. Finally, he lifted his head, his face blotchy and his eyes red-rimmed. He looked exhausted, but he also looked lighter. The emptiness in his eyes was gone, and in its place was just a vast, deep sadness. And he was looking at me, really looking at me for the first time in weeks. "Her name was Sarah," he began, his voice raspy. He picked up the photograph, his hand no longer shaking. "She was my college sweetheart. She had a laugh that could fill a whole room, just like yours." He managed a weak, watery smile. "We got married. We were so young. And then we had Daniel." He pointed a finger at the baby in the blue blanket. "That's him. Your brother. He was perfect." His voice cracked and he took a shaky breath. "But after he was born, Sarah, she got sick. Not a cold or a flu. It was a sickness in her heart, in her mind. She became so sad, Clara. So sad that she couldn't see the sunshine anymore. The doctors tried to help, but nothing worked. She just drifted further and further away." He fell silent for a moment, lost in the memory. "One day," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I came home from work. She was gone. And Daniel, he was gone too." He didn't need to say the words. I was only 8, but I understood. I understood the forever kind of gone. I was so angry and so lost. I packed away everything that reminded me of them. I put them in this box. I thought if I buried the memories, I could bury the pain. The study door creaked open. Mom stood there, her face etched with worry. She saw us. My hand on his arm, the tears on his face, the open box on the desk. She didn't scold me for being out of bed. She walked in and wrapped her arms around both of us, pulling me into a hug that included my father. I was squished between them, and for the first time in a long time, our family felt whole again. "I'm so sorry, Tom," she whispered into his hair. "You never had to carry this alone. I thought I was protecting you," he choked out. "Protecting Clara from all this." Mom pulled back and looked him in the eyes, her own filled with love and a little bit of sadness for all the silent years. "We're a family," she said firmly. "We carry things together." That night didn't magically fix everything. There was no fairy tale ending where all the sadness disappeared, but it broke the silence. The next morning, I woke up to a familiar smell. I ran to the kitchen, and there was Dad, at the stove, flipping a pancake shaped like a lopsided dinosaur. He looked over at me and smiled. A real smile. It didn't reach his eyes quite yet, but it was a start. We didn't hide the photograph away again. A few days later, Dad put it in a new frame and placed it on the mantelpiece in the living room. It wasn't a secret anymore. It was a part of our story. Sarah, the woman with the sad smile, and Daniel, the brother I never knew. They were a part of our family. The noise started to come back to our house after that, slowly at first, then all at once. The laughter returned. The happy dinners returned. It was different, though. It was a noise born not from ignoring the sadness, but from acknowledging it, from holding it together. I learned that families are like old houses, with creaky floors and hidden rooms. Some rooms hold joy, and some hold sorrow, but they are all part of the same home. And true strength isn't about keeping the sad doors locked. It's about having the courage to open them, together, and let the light in. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a message of hope.